My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and it's finally time to continue with my series of extreme nitpicks of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Been a lot of tangents in between part 1 and now finally part 2, but we finally made it back, so let's get started with this mess. We pick up with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli in the forest of Fangorn, chasing down, hopefully, they think, Merry and Pippin, and we get Gimli tasting some blood off of a leaf, and he puts it in his mouth, spits it out, and says, "Orc blood." And my only thought is, how do you know that, Gimli? Because, okay, let's assume, for sake of argument, that Gimli has tasted orc blood in some manner or other. I'm not sure I want to know the circumstances behind that in the first place. But to be able to distinguish orc blood from other kinds of blood, he would also have had to taste other kinds of blood. How is he doing this? Is he like Sherlock Holmes with a laboratory where he collects different samples and tests and tastes them all so that he can deduce what it is? Just, it's not a pleasant idea to really pursue, is it? Shortly after this, we get Legolas saying, in Elvish, "Something's out there," to Aragorn. And why is he saying this in Elvish? So that only Aragorn actually knows what he's saying? It doesn't, like, are you not going to warn the other guy who you're actually friendly with that there's danger out there in them woods? I mean, okay, like I can kind of understand maybe where this is coming from. It's like in the book there's a similar type of thing where whenever there are orcs around, Legolas, and this is the actual phrase used in the book, slipping back into his own tongue or something like that, uses the Elvish word "ich" as opposed to just orcs. And so you could make the argument that here Legolas is doing the same thing. It's, he's just kind of slipping back into his own native tongue and not thinking about, the fact that he needs to communicate to more than just somebody who speaks Elfish. But it doesn't seem like he's totally shocked in such a way that he would just burst out with, whatever language comes most naturally. He's kind of being fairly deliberate and doesn't really seem like a good explanation here. So it's just like he's just leaving Gimli in the dark for no apparent reason. Next, after Gandalf meets up with our trio, Gandalf begins to explain to Aragorn, while the others are apparently asleep, that Theoden's mind is enslaved, and then he adds on as a sort of afterthought, it's an old device of Saruman's. Really? And you didn't suspect he was a bad guy if enslaving minds is a thing that he does? Now, in the book, of course, the explanation that you might be able to pull together for this is the fact that Saruman does have a really strong trait of being able to convince other people through the power of his voice. And that's all well and good. But A, that's not what's going on in this movie. He has, in some literal sense, possessed Theoden such that, whenever we see Gandalf and Theoden interact later, his voice comes out of Theoden. And he is controlling Theoden's actions. It's not that he has persuaded Theoden. It is not... this is a straight-on, just not okay type of thing that Saruman has done, and Gandalf is acting like this is something that's just, oh yeah, that's a thing Saruman does. What? No! If you knew that was a thing that he was doing, not uncommonly, you would have not really thought of him as a good guy and an ally at the beginning of the whole story. That doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So if they should have just left that line out. Now we go back to Frodo and Sam for a bit. They, led by Gollum, make it to the Black Gate, and of course Sam has his little mini adventure where he crawls a little too far forward and then falls down the hill and makes it, all the way to the bottom, somehow buried up to his waist, which is weird in and of itself. Like, how did you get buried in that much dirt just by falling down the hill? But of course, Frodo can't dig him out in time, and so he covers himself with the cloak, and it ends up looking like just one big rock. Which, okay, I know why they're doing that. That's not what the issue is. But the Easterling guy who is, apparently seen something out of the corner of his eye and is going to check whatever it is, walks over, and if you pay very close attention to the scene, it does not appear that they could have been far enough away to have not seen Frodo and Sam very obviously just out in the open before he got up to that point. Like, it's not like there's a big, huge round in the hill or something that he came around. The way this scene is shot makes it seem very impossible that this guy would not have actually seen Sam just at the bottom of the hill and Frodo trying to get him out. I mean, it doesn't seem to work. It's maybe it's just a weird thing the way that they shot it, or I don't know what, but they did not do anything to make it seem like this could have worked at all. Skipping back to Rohan real quick, we get a scene after Wormtongue has been kicked out of Rohan, and he ends up going back to Saruman in his tower, and he describes the three people that were there with Gandalf, and he mentions that Aragorn was a man out of the north, and that his cloth was poor, and he says, "One of the Dunedain ranges I thought he was." And how does he know about the Dunedain Rangers? This just seems to be a thing in this whole trilogy where everybody just knows about the Dunedain Rangers. Like when Boromir at the Council of Elrond says, "What does a ranger know of this matter?" And then now Grima's doing the same thing. "One of the Dunedain Rangers I thought he was." It's like, how does everybody know who they are? And yet apparently nobody knows who they are. The Dunedain Rangers, I mean, it's like Boromir knows who the Rangers are, but doesn't recognize that that's exactly what would make Aragorn particularly interested and knowledgeable about the whole situation. And then Grima is apparently also just well-versed in the fact that there's Dunedain running around up in the north. It's just an assumed thing in these movies that this is just a well-known group of people for some reason, which just, okay, in Bree, yeah, they know, because that's where they're hanging out. That's where they are. They travel around there. Why would Wormtongue know about these people at all? Next, we get to one of my least favorite changes that Peter Jackson made for this movie, which is the people of Rohan get into a brief fight with orcs riding wargs, which is completely unnecessary and results in the even more unnecessary fake death of Aragorn when he gets, basically hurled off the edge of a cliff by a galloping warg who has no sense to stop, which is, smart. But, you can excuse all of that, but then when Aragorn finally makes it to the bottom and apparently lands in the river, quite lucky, he floats downstream for a long ways. Now, if you watch the the extended cut extra materials in the appendices, they do actually talk about the fact that Aragorn almost drowned in this scene because they hit a bad patch of water and he almost got pulled under and it did not go well. But the real question is, why is he floating at all when he's unconscious? Have you ever tried just floating on your back in the water? I know it's doable, but Aragorn is wearing a bunch of gear, including a sword, which is definitely not buoyant. And other stuff as well. Is he got hidden floaters in his cloak? Because there's no way he should be floating that easily. That does not fly. Physics does not work that way. So yeah, he should have just drowned if he was unconscious. He should not just be floating like he's on the, he looks like he's lying on flat ground because no part of him is actually submerged in the water. Just enough of his, body is below surface level, but I mean, none of it is sunk. If I try to do like a starfish in the water, my legs just drop immediately. They just do. I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't think Aragorn could have actually done that. This next one is not a problem in and of itself, but it sets up a potential problem because what we see is an image of Arwen kissing Aragorn, and apparently this is it's not exactly clear how this is supposed to be perceived. Is she somehow psychically actually communicating with him? Is he just dreaming this? What exactly is going on in this particular scene? But assuming, for sake of argument, that this is actually supposed to be her kind of, at least, if not psychically connecting with him, in some sense, thinking about him, and that is why the connection is there, because it does, she does say, "May the grace of the Valar protect you," as if she's praying for him, basically. If that's the case, and it's happening when it seems to be happening in connection with her time with Elrond and his time in Rohan, how on earth does Elrond later get to Rohan fast enough with the sword reforged? Because that's a long trip, guys. And Aragorn, yeah, he gets, this happens, and then in the space of basically a few days, is going to end up at the camp at Dunharrow. It's not going to take very long. I mean, it's more than a few days probably, but it's more than a few days for Elrond to get from Rivendell all the way to Dunharrow. So it just really doesn't seem likely that that's a feasible trip if these things are actually happening in sync as they seem to be happening in the story. Speaking of Elrond, we get his little psychic conversation with Galadriel, and Galadriel calls Gondor the last free kingdom of men. Which, this is one of those, this kind of goes back to the whole, I think I mentioned this one in my Fellowship series, where I talked about how Elrond says that men are scattered, divided, and leaderless. They're not. They have multiple different kingdoms, each with their own leaders, because you've got Theoden in Rohan, you've got the Steward of Gondor in Gondor, you've even got King Brand in Dale. There are not one kingdom of men, sure, but each kingdom of men has their own king and leader. Well, this is kind of the same problem. She says it's the last free kingdom of men. Well, what about Rohan? You could maybe make the argument that here she's saying it's not really free because it's in the middle of a war, which is likely to, be the end of it, and therefore it's not free in the sense that it's not free to do whatever it wants because it's literally on the brink of collapse under war. But there's still other kingdoms in Middle-earth, which we're going to find out about, by the way, when the Hobbit trilogy comes out, because we're going to find out about Dale and how it gets reestablished after the events of The Hobbit. So, it's like, just, why do you got to throw in lines like this, Peter? Like, it just, there's no reason to go there. It doesn't make any sense. You don't have to make it extra dramatic just for the purposes of being like, oh, this is the last, bulwark before, you can do something like that with Boromir's actual line from the book where he says, if Gondor falls, the rest of Middle-earth is going to collapse, which is basically true, because Gondor may not be the last free kingdom of men, but it is the last really big and strong one. And so without Gondor, it is pretty much, hopeless. I mean, they do have to have Gondor there. But you don't have to say something as inaccurate as the last free kingdom of men to get that message across. So it's just like, building up the drama of the scene by being inaccurate is really just not necessary. Next we get a scene where Faramir is getting a intelligence update from one of his men, and he says that scouts report that Saruman has attacked Helm's Deep. Or that, well, he's technically what he says is Saruman has attacked Rohan, and Theoden's people have fled to Helm's Deep. But in either case, I mean, first of all, again, we have a sync problem here in terms of the chronology. Frodo and Sam have been out on their thing. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli have been out on their thing. It would have taken some days for anybody to get from Rohan back to Gondor, let alone to Faramir, who is not the person who needs to know this. Denethor probably would need to know that. Faramir really doesn't, because his position right now is just manning the people who are, the positions that are east of the river, Anduin. He doesn't need to know what's going on in Isengard. Denethor, who is masterminding Gondor's entire defensive strategy, might need to know it. Why would Faramir? But the real problem is, how would he find this out? He says they've sent scouts out, but first of all, why would you send scouts out just to see what's happening in Rohan right now? But the other one is, the timing of it just doesn't really work. There's no way you could send somebody out there and get back in the amount of time that it would take, given the fact of the chronology that we have it, because the way that everything falls out, Frodo and Sam are in Ithilien around the same time all the stuff in Rohan is happening, and if that's the case, any message that could possibly be reached by Faramir would come days later after Frodo and Sam have already left. There's just no way he could actually have this information at the point in the story where he's getting it. It's like they have satellite imagery. You could explain that with a Palantir, but they're not talking about Palantir. They're talking about scouts, and it just doesn't work. Then we get a flashback where Faramir remembers some, stuff that happened in Osgiliath while Boromir was there. Happy memories with Boromir, not so happy memories of Denethor. And Denethor pulls Boromir aside and says, "It's rumored the weapon of the enemy has been found." And Boromir's like, "The One Ring." And the problem with this is, first of all, in the book, this does not happen. When Elrond does not call a meeting, that's not a thing. And if he did, you'd think he'd be smarter than to call a meeting. I mean, think about this for a second, because this kind of goes back to the Fellowship. We already know what Elrond's opinions of men are. He doesn't particularly like or think much of them, right? Yet he's going to call a bunch of them to a meeting about the ring, which he does not think they are safe or competent to handle. Okay. Leaving that aside, though, the main point I wanted to get at for this video is, how does Denethor have rumor of this? Where is he getting this information? Okay, you could assume maybe he's using the Palantir to, look around and try to get more information. But the Palantir doesn't show him anything pertinent. I mean, how's he going to see anything useful in it? Elrond calls a meeting, he says. And if Elrond called a meeting, that means it would take some days for that message to get all the way to Gondor, and a bunch more days for Boromir to finally get to Rivendell. This has to have happened before Frodo ever made it to Rivendell. Assuming that's the case, and I don't think we have to assume, I think it's pretty much certain, if Denethor was out there looking for stuff with a Palantir, and he's looking, in the vicinity of Rivendell, because where else would he look? What information is he going to get that's going to indicate that, this has been found? Saruman's not going to tell him, because Saruman's keeping everything close to the vest so that he can get the ring for himself. So he's not getting it from Saruman. He's definitely not getting it from anybody in Rohan, because they know nothing about anything. Where is he getting this idea that the ring has been found? It doesn't make any sense. And the other problem with it is, it undermines Boromir's whole story at the council where he said that he had the dream. Really? What? He said he had a dream and the eastern sky grew dark and he heard a voice and all this other stuff. It's like, well, what was the real reason Boromir went? Was it the dream or was it Denethor? What was the point of the dream if it had nothing to do with why he went there? What was... none of it even makes sense anymore because of the way the Peter Jackson movies actually set up everything. It's like they go back and retcon all the background in a way that makes everything not really make any sense when we get to the events of the actual story. It's so weird. It's like Tolkien wrote out the timeline. He wrote out the reasons everybody did what they did. It's like you didn't have to mess with that. It was already there for you. Why did you screw it up? Next, we get a scene where Theoden is trying to prepare Helm's Deep for the inevitable assault by Uruk-hai. And we get another comment from Gimli, which is difficult to explain. He says, this is no rabble of mindless orcs. These are Uruk-hai. Their armor is thick, and their shields broad. When has Gimli ever seen a single Uruk-hai carrying a shield or wearing armor? The only Uruk-hai he's encountered are the roving band that came and captured Merry and Pippin, and they were all lightly armored at best, maybe with leather, and had no shields. Where is he getting this intelligence? Next, we get one of my least favorite lines that was added to this movie. I've never liked this one, and it's about how they kind of changed Eowyn's character for this story, because frankly, I think Peter Jackson and or the Philippa Boyens and Fran Walsh, whoever was doing the writing for this, wanted to make Eowyn a bit more of a feminist icon than she is in the book, because in the book it's pretty clear that it's a negative thing that she's constantly wanting to go into battle, and by the way, her main goal there is to get killed. Instead, they have to make Eowyn this really heroic character who's like, see, girls can fight too. And it's like, yes, girls can fight, but like that's really not the point. But we get this line where she's trying to convince Aragorn to let her fight in the battle because she's been told to stay with the women and children. And he says, it's not in my power to command it. Because he's not her uncle and he's not the king. He's just a guy who happens to be in Rohan, right? And then she says, and this line, this is the kind of line you would expect a distraught person who is not thinking but acting purely on emotion to say. And so in that sense, it's not really a huge problem, but it's so illogical that it bugs me to no end. She says, you do not command the others to stay. They fight beside you because they love you. And, I'm shortening it up a little bit. The point was, it's like, of course he doesn't command them to stay. It's Legolas and Gimli. It's not like he's the commander of an army of which they happen to be members. And it's not like Theoden has any real say over what Legolas and Gimli do. They're there of their own free will. They can leave anytime they want. He's not their boss. Neither Aragorn nor Theoden is their boss. It's like, Eowyn, what are you even trying to say here? Because it doesn't make any sense. It's just like, yeah, he doesn't command the others to stay because he can't. Just like he can't command her, and he can't command any of these people except insofar as Theoden may give him some like deputized role as a commander in what small army he has at Helm's Deep. But Legolas and Gimli aren't part of that, and neither is Eowyn, and Eowyn's already gotten orders, so like I said, I understand when people talk from their heart and not their head, they say stupid things, but this one to me is beyond dumb, to the point that even Eowyn in a really emotionally charged state, I don't think would say something quite this brainless. Now we finally get a scene with Merry and Pippin and some Ents. And this one, I know why it's in. It's in because it is kind of based on the book, and it is funny, but it also really ruins the timeline again. And that is the scene where Merry and Pippin, are talking, and one of them says, surely they've decided something by now, and Treebeard turns around and says, decided? No. We only just finished saying good morning. And of course that is based on the book, because in the book Merry and Pippin are, not really part of the conversation, and one of them says, given how slow they are, they might not have gotten past saying good morning yet. So in the book, it's actually a joke told by one of the hobbits. In the movie, Fangorn does not seem to be telling a joke. He's being quite serious. And the thing is, given that they met in broad daylight and it's now nighttime of, I'm assuming the first day, and it took him that long to say good morning, how long would it take to get to the actual business of the Entmoot and do something? Days and days. Which, by the way, in the book, it actually does take a few days before the Entmoot makes its decision. I don't remember exactly how many days. It may only be 2, maybe 3. But the point is, again, in the movie, you get the idea these events are happening with some synchronicity. And so the fact that the Ents start with good morning that takes all of at least an afternoon, it just doesn't work time-wise, because there's no possible way they could make it to do anything after that. And speaking of more time problems, Galadriel and Elrond, of course, have their little conversation, and Galadriel says, "Do we let them stand alone?" And then, of course, we get elves coming, which, weirdly enough, when Haldir arrives with his elves, he says he brings word from Elrond of Rivendell, even though they're coming from Lothlorien. What? Okay, I don't understand that. But the real problem again here is the timing. How did these elves get there in time? Is it possible? You have to remember, Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli ran for days to try to catch up with Merry and Pippin, rode to Edoras, and then in the space of a day it was decided, we're going to Helm's Deep, which then takes a little more time, and it's on the 5th day that Gandalf arrives. So the day after, apparently, the elves get there, because the elves get there the night, and then Gandalf shows up with Eomer the next morning. So it's not really clear how many of the days were spent traveling from Edoras and how many were spent just in Helm's Deep. But in either event, we're talking a trip of many, many days for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli from the Falls of Rauros. Not Lothlorien, the Falls, which is several days downriver from Lothlorien. These elves are all on foot. How'd they get there in time? It doesn't make any sense. You have to assume they started out well before any of the events that are actually being depicted on the ground, which means Galadriel and Elrond had to have had this conversation well before, which means all the events that we see in Rivendell, and not really Lorien, we only see Galadriel's face, really, are all taking place days and days before any of this stuff. Because you have to remember, Elrond is talking to Galadriel, but we've already seen Elrond talking to Arwen, which means the Arwen stuff with Aragorn must be out of sync too. The timeline has to be so convoluted and messed up here, there's no possible way to make it all work. And it was unnecessary. You didn't have to have elves show up at Helm's Deep. There's a reason the Last Alliance is called the Last Alliance, is because there's no other alliances between elves and men after that. It just doesn't happen. So it didn't need to be thrown in there. And we didn't need to see Haldir die either, by the way. I'm kind of peeved at that, even though Haldir is not really that great of a character in this movie compared to what I think he was in the book. But, that's another story. Just before the fighting starts, Aragorn is giving some instructions to the elves in Elvish, because he's actually just commanding the elves and not the men, and so it makes sense that he would actually use Elvish, right? But one of the lines that he gives always makes me chuckle, because he says, "Show them no mercy because they'll show you none." It's like, Aragorn, these elves are probably all like a few thousand years old at least, and probably have fought orcs before. I don't think they need you to tell them how to engage with orcs. And that orcs will show no mercy. This is not... for us, the viewers, it's not even necessary at this point, because we already know what orcs are like. They're evil, they're barbarous, they're cruel, they will just... we don't even need that. It's adding to the drama of the scene a little bit, but it's really just saying out loud what literally everybody already knows. It's just so weird to me that they even bothered to put that in. And then when the Uruk-hai finally get in range, Theoden is, having the archers ready to fire but not actually shooting, which doesn't make any sense to me. We know these guys are about to attack. It's not like you actually have to wait for them to make the first move. They're in range. You might as well just start hailing them with arrows. And then after the first guy accidentally lets loose and shoots an Uruk-hai and quite luckily kills him in one shot, really lucky, he gets this whole thing of hold your fire. He says hold your fire. It's like, there's no going back. You might as well get started chopping down the bad guys now. Maximize your odds of success. Really? Why hold fire? Speaking of shooting arrows, Legolas is the world's best archer, and he misses twice on the most important target of the entire battle. You know what I'm talking about. The Berserker Uruk-hai with the torch, which is apparently made of something other than regular fire because it's sparking all over the place. And the other thing is, if you look at the way the arrows go into that guy's shoulder, it's like they're almost sticking straight up, and yet Legolas is clearly firing at much shallower of an angle. This is the only way I think they could make it look like he had a reasonable chance to miss, but it doesn't actually work. And it's like, you have already built Legolas up to be this amazing superhuman archer who can just kill who knows how many orcs in no time flat because he's just that good. And yet we get the, two worst. I mean, it's not even a hard target. I mean, he's just down there running with nobody in his way because literally everybody's getting out of his way so as to give him room to run to get to the target, which is the bomb. And Legolas can't hit him despite this after 2 tries of careful aiming, when normally he's just like 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, he's literally throughout the battle, he's counting his kills against Gimli, and it's like 1 shot per kill. Now he gets 2 shots and can't even hit a lethal spot on the guy. You cannot make your characters out to be that good and then make them that incompetent. It just doesn't work. Like, if you wanted to solve this problem, the way to do it would be to have him shoot somewhere that was actually lethal and have the orc carry on anyway, because he's just that bad to the bone and gruesome and he can't be stopped. That would have been fine. Because, I mean, in all seriousness, arrows don't actually kill in 1 shot. Unless even people have been shot in the eye and survived and lived to fight on. Unless you hit just the right spot. Like, if you manage to shoot somebody in the eye at just the right angle to really tear up their brain, you're probably not killing anybody just in 1 shot with an arrow anyway. So, this was unnecessary. Then when Gandalf and Éomer finally arrived to save the day, they charged down the hilltop, and they are charging into literally the worst thing that a cavalry charge can charge into, which is a bunch of pikes. And this is kind of silly because the Uruk-hai are literally carrying these things as anti-cavalry weapons. It's the only reason to have them in this scenario. And we know that they're doing it for that reason because Rohan is a cavalry-based military. I mean, that's just the truth. And then when they start coming down the hill, the only reason they don't all just die on the pikes, the horses that is because light comes over and the Uruk-hai, quite stupidly, all go, I can't see. And it's like, dude, you're in the military, you're trained, you don't care. You know there's a cavalry charge coming. You just hold the pike. You don't have to see. That's kind of the point. So the way that whole scene goes down is just, from a realism perspective, just nuts to me. Finally, and this will round out our 2 towers, because we actually got through all of it in 2 sittings, interestingly enough, we get the scene in Osgiliath where the Nazgul shows up, and then Frodo, completely unaccountably, climbs up some stairs onto I don't know if it's platform, I don't know exactly what it's supposed to be, maybe just an arch of a building that's no longer standing, but he gets up there and he just holds the ring out, and he's like very slowly about to put it on while the Nazgul just comes up and he's about to grab Frodo in the ring. It's like, why is this happening? The whole point of the ring and the Nazgul is the Nazgul are supposed to make you terrified, and the ring is supposed to make you want to put it on. And the reason you put on the ring is to hide. And the reason that you, like, I mean, everything about this is backwards. The idea of going in front of the thing that's really scary in order to put on the ring so that you can hide, it just makes no sense whatsoever. The idea of that it would take him that long to do it is also insane. Why is he going up the thing in the first place? Why is he climbing the stairs up onto this whatever it is? And then why is he not just instantly putting the ring on? It's not like he's resisting. You can tell he's not resisting because the way he's looking at the Nazgul is not like, I'm afraid. It's more like, I'm in a stupor. You know, I mean, it's that kind of thing. And he's not shaking in fear. He's not, you know, we've seen scenes where he's been like, I want to put it on, but I know I shouldn't. You know, we've seen him do that. He's not doing that here either. The only thing he's doing here is just very, very slowly putting the ring on as if he's in a trance. Well, if he's under that level of mind control, why would it take him that long to do it? And also, it just doesn't make sense with what we know about everything else anyway, because the Nazgul are supposed to be really scary and make you want to hide, not come right up out in the open and present yourself saying, here I am. They just, again, it's one of these where they just want to increase the drama of the scene, but they do it in a way that is completely nonsensical. All right, so that is the second and final part of Nitpicking The Two Towers by Peter Jackson. Hope you enjoyed that. I will be moving on now to the flip side of details he actually got right in the movie next time, assuming there's not a bunch more tangents in between again. And then we'll finally wrap up by hitting the Return of the King eventually. I'm getting there. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like it, share it around. I've got the other videos in this series linked in the description below so you can follow up if you have not already been following this series. Make sure you subscribe if you want to catch my future content, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any of the notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions on a regular basis, and check the description for other social and support links as well. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan DeFore, Robert Kendling, and Stephen Clayton.